Zander wiped his hands on his apron and let out a quiet sigh as he glanced at the clock above the kitchen door. Another long shift at the diner, another night of aching feet and barely making enough to cover rent. He pulled his notepad from his pocket as he stepped out onto the floor, forcing a polite smile as he approached the next table. Seated by the window was an elderly woman, her silver hair neatly curled, her cardigan buttoned all the way up despite the warmth of the diner. She was looking down at the menu with a small frown, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Zander cleared his throat gently. "Good evening, ma'am. What can I get for you?" The woman looked up, her eyes kind but tired. "Oh, hello, dear." She gave him a warm smile. "I'd like the chicken pot pie, please, and a cup of tea if you don't mind." "Of course," Zander replied, jotting it down. "Would you like anything else?" She hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "That will be all for now, thank you." Zander nodded and walked back to the kitchen, placing the order with the cook before heading to the counter to prepare her tea. He had seen her a few times before, always alone, always ordering something small and simple. There was a quiet dignity about her, the way she sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight despite her frail frame. He returned a few minutes later with her tea, setting it down gently in front of her. She smiled up at him. "You're very kind, young man." Zander chuckled lightly. "Just doing my job." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, sighing softly. "It's nice to have someone who takes the time to be kind. Not everyone does." Zander wasn't sure what to say to that, so he simply nodded and excused himself, returning to the other tables. He had customers to tend to, plates to clear, and refills to bring. But every now and then, he found himself glancing back at the woman by the window, something about her reminding him of his own grandmother, who had passed years ago. When her meal was finally ready, he brought it over and placed it in front of her. She thanked him again, her gratitude genuine, and he left her to eat in peace. It wasn't until later, when the dinner rush had slowed down, that he noticed her at the register, rummaging through her purse with a troubled expression. Zander approached cautiously. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" She looked up at him, her face lined with worry. "I think my card isn't working. I'm so sorry, dear. I don't know what happened. It was working just fine earlier." Zander glanced at the total on the register. It wasn't much, just under $20. He hesitated for only a second before reaching into his pocket and pulling out his own wallet. "Don't worry about it," he said, sliding his own card into the reader. The woman's eyes widened. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly let you do that." "It's all right," Zander assured her with a small smile. "It's just a meal." Her eyes glistened as she clasped his hand in hers. "You are very kind, young man. I'll find a way to pay you back, promise." Zander shook his head. "No need, just take care of yourself, okay?" She nodded slowly, still looking at him with something between gratitude and amazement. After a moment, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad and pen, scribbling something down before handing it to him. "My name is Ellie," she said softly. "I don't forget kindness, Zander." He looked at the note, a neatly written address and her full name, Ellie Whitmore. He tucked it into his pocket, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," she whispered before turning toward the door. Zander watched her go, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He didn't know why he had done it, he barely had enough money for himself, but something about her had made it feel right. He didn't think much of it after that. Just another long night, another shift, another meal given away. But the next evening, as he was wiping down the counter, the door swung open, and a tall man in a sharp suit strode in, his eyes scanning the diner until they landed on Zander. "You Zander?" the man asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Zander straightened, suddenly feeling nervous. Yeah, can I help you?" The man took a step closer, extending a hand. "I'm Nathan Whitmore. My mother told me about you." Zander frowned slightly as he shook the man's hand. Your mother. Nathan nodded. Ellie Whitmore, she told me what you did for her last night. Zander rubbed the back of his neck. Oh, it wasn't a big deal, really. Nathan let out a quiet chuckle. You say that, but it meant a lot to her, and to me. Zander glanced around, feeling self-conscious. She seemed like she needed a little help. It didn't feel right to let her go hungry over a few dollars. Nathan studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. That's rare. Not a lot of people would do that. Zander shrugged. I don't know. I think most people are good, they just don't always get the chance to show it. Nathan smiled slightly. Well, I appreciate it, and I wanted to meet you in person. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the counter. Zander looked down at it, his eyebrows raising slightly when he saw the name. Nathan Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Hospitality Group. He looked back up at Nathan, suddenly realizing why the last name sounded familiar. Whitmore Hospitality Group owned this diner, and several others. Nathan's smile widened at Zander's expression. Yeah, that's me. Zander swallowed. Yeah. Nathan chuckled. Relax, you're not in trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. Zander's stomach twisted with curiosity, but before he could say anything else, Nathan continued. I'd like to talk to you more. About your work, your life, and maybe just maybe about how can return the kindness you showed my mother. Zander blinked, unsure of what to say. He had no idea what was coming next, but something told him his life was about to change. Zander stared at the business card on the counter, his mind racing. Nathan Whitmore stood before him, waiting patiently for a response. The CEO of Whitmore Hospitality Group, the man who technically owned the very diner where Zander spent grueling hours just trying to scrape by. Zander cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. You want to talk about my work and my life? He wasn't sure what Nathan was getting at. People like Nathan didn't usually take an interest in people like him. Nathan nodded. That's right. I don't often hear stories about employees going out of their way for customers. His gaze was steady, his tone thoughtful. Tell me, why did you do it? Zander hesitated, shifting his weight. It wasn't something I really thought about, he admitted. She reminded me of my grandmother, and I know what it's like to feel stuck, to feel like there's no way out. It didn't seem right to let her stress over a meal. Nathan studied him for a moment before pulling up a stool at the counter. You have a good heart, Zander. He glanced around the diner, taking in the worn booths, the flickering sign outside the window, the tired employees moving mechanically through their tasks. How long have you been working here? Almost 3 years, Zander said. And before that? Zander exhaled through his nose. I bounced around, did some construction work for a while, worked at a warehouse, even tried an office job once. None of it stuck. This place. It's not much, but at least I know what to expect. Nathan nodded slowly. And is this where you see yourself staying? Zander opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He hadn't really thought about it. He supposed he had just accepted that this was his lifelong shifts, aching feet, barely making enough to cover rent. He had dreams once, bigger dreams, but they had been swallowed by reality. I don't know, he admitted. I guess I never really had the time to think past just surviving. Nathan tapped his fingers against the counter, considering. That's a hard way to live. He looked Zander in the eye. You strike me as someone who could do more, someone who should be doing more. Zander let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Appreciate the vote of confidence, but I don't exactly have a lot of options. Nathan's expression remained unreadable. Maybe you do. Zander frowned slightly, but before he could ask what that meant, a voice called from the kitchen. Zander, we need you back here. Zander glanced toward the swinging door, then back at Nathan. Should get back to work. Nathan stood, adjusting his cufflinks. I'll be in touch. Zander watched him leave, unsure of what to make of the conversation. People like Nathan didn't just show up in diners like this, and they certainly didn't take an interest in people like him. The next few days passed with little change. Zander went to work, collected tips that barely added up, and tried not to think too hard about the conversation with Nathan. He doubted he would ever hear from him again. What reason would a man like that have to remember a struggling waiter? But then, late one evening, just as Zander was finishing his shift, Ellie returned. She walked in slowly, her cardigan wrapped tightly around her. Zander immediately noticed that she looked more tired than before, though she still carried herself with quiet dignity. She spotted him behind the counter and gave him a small smile. "Hello again, Zander." He returned the smile despite his exhaustion. "Good to see you again, Ellie. Can I get you something?" She shook her head. "No, dear, I actually came to see you." Zander wiped his hands on a towel and leaned slightly against the counter. "Everything all right?" She hesitated before speaking. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did the other night. I know you said it wasn't a big deal, but to me, it was." She lowered her voice slightly. "I don't usually have trouble with my card, but things have been a little difficult lately." Zander frowned. "You mean financially?" She gave a small nod. "My husband passed away a few years ago, and though he left me with enough to be comfortable, some unexpected things have come up." Zander didn't pry, but he could see the strain on her face. "I'm sorry to hear that." She reached across the counter, patting his hand. "You remind me of my son when he was younger, always looking out for others." Zander thought about Nathan, about the sharp suit and confident presence. It was hard to imagine him as anything other than the powerful businessman he was now. Ellie smiled fondly, as if reading his thoughts. "Nathan wasn't always the man you met the other night. He worked his way up, same as anyone else. He knows what it's like to struggle." Zander raised an eyebrow. The CEO of a major company knows what it's like to struggle. She chuckled. "You'd be surprised. He wasn't born into money. He built his success from nothing. That's why he appreciates people like you." Zander absorbed that, unsure of how to respond. Ellie slowly stood. "I just wanted to see you again, to thank you properly." He smiled. "You don't have to keep thanking me, Ellie." She gave him a knowing look. "We'll see about that." And with that, she left, leaving Zander with more questions than answers. The next week passed as usual, long shifts, tired nights, barely scraping by. Zander had almost convinced himself that the encounter with Nathan had been a one-time thing. Then, one afternoon, just as he was about to clock in, his manager pulled him aside. "There's someone here asking for you," the manager said, looking both confused and slightly intimidated. Zander stepped out onto the floor and immediately spotted Nathan sitting at one of the booths, checking his watch. Taking a deep breath, Zander approached. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Nathan looked up, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I told you I'd be in touch." Zander slid into the seat across from him. "So, what's this about?" Nathan folded his hands on the table. "I've been thinking about you, about what you said the other night. You're sharp, you work hard, and more importantly, you care about people. That's not something you see every day." Zander frowned slightly. "Appreciate that, but don't understand why you're here." Nathan leaned forward slightly. "I have an opportunity for you." Zander's stomach tightened. "What kind of opportunity?" Nathan's expression was unreadable. "Something that could change your life." Zander's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what Nathan was about to say. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years' hope. Zander shifted in his seat, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure what kind of opportunity Nathan was referring to, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Nathan studied him before speaking. I run a lot of businesses, but at the core, hospitality is about people. People like you who understand kindness, who see others as more than just customers. Zander frowned slightly. Appreciate that, but I don't see how that connects to me. Nathan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You've been working in this diner for years. You know the ins and outs, how to handle people, and you work hard. But you're stuck. You told me yourself that you never had the time to think past surviving. Zander glanced at the table, unsure of what to say. Nathan wasn't wrong. Nathan continued. I started from nothing, just like you. I worked kitchens, did overnight shifts, barely made ends meet. But someone gave me a chance once, and I took it. That's why I'm here, because I see something in you. Xander's brow furrowed. You don't even know me. Nathan nodded. That's true, but I know the kind of person who helps a stranger without expecting anything in return. That tells me everything I need to know. Zander swallowed. He had spent years being overlooked, just another name on a payroll, another worker barely scraping by. And now, here was a man who actually saw him. Nathan sat back. I'm offering you a position with my company, not as a waiter, something more, something that will actually use your potential. Zander blinked. A position. Nathan nodded. I want to put you in a management training program. You'd start by learning the ropes at one of my higher-end restaurants. You'll be paid fairly, given the tools to build a career. Over time, if you prove yourself, you could move up. Zander felt his heart pound. It sounded too good to be real. He had spent so long just trying to make it through the day, never once considering that a future beyond this diner existed. But then doubt crept in. Why me? Nathan exhaled. Because trust my mother's judgment, and because I see myself in you. Xander's throat tightened. Nathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Think about it. I won't pressure you, but I believe in giving people away out of places they don't belong. Zander took the card, running his thumb over the embossed name. The weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy blanket. Nathan stood. I hope to hear from you soon. Zander watched him leave, his mind spinning. That night, he lay awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling. He had never considered management, never once thought that someone like him could be anything more than a worker. But now, the possibility sat in his hands, and he didn't know if he was ready for it. The next few days passed in a blur. He went to work, followed the same routine, but his mind kept returning to the card in his pocket. His coworkers noticed his distraction, but he brushed off their questions. One evening, Ellie returned. She walked in slowly, her expression thoughtful as she approached the counter. Zander greeted her, trying to mask his exhaustion. Back again. She gave a knowing look. You seem troubled. Zander hesitated before sighing. Your son offered me something big. Ellie nodded as if she had already known. And you don't know if you should take it. Zander rubbed a hand over his face. It feels too big, like I don't belong in that kind of world. Ellie folded her hands. Understand. When Nathan was younger, he doubted himself too. He almost didn't take the opportunity that set him on his path. Zander looked up. Really? She smiled. Oh yes, he was afraid of failing, but told him something then that I'll tell you now: you only fail if you never try. Zander let her words sink in. Ellie continued. You helped me when you didn't have to. That tells me you're not just kind, but brave, and bravery is what you need to step forward. Zander exhaled. What if I mess up? Ellie chuckled. Then you learn and you try again. Zander felt something shift inside him. Ellie patted his hand gently. Whatever you decide, just know that you deserve more than just surviving. That night, Zander sat at his kitchen table, staring at the business card. He thought about his life, the years of scraping by, the exhaustion that never seemed to fade. But then he thought about Ellie's words. And for the first time in forever, he made a decision for himself. He picked up his phone and dialed the number. Nathan answered almost immediately. Zander. Zander took a deep breath. I'm in. Nathan's tone was steady. Good, let's get started. Zander didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was ready to find out. The following day, he arrived for his shift as usual, but something felt different. Conversations around him seemed distant, the clatter of dishes and the hum of the kitchen blending into a background noise that no longer felt permanent. This place had been his routine, his stability, but now, for the first time, it felt like something he was preparing to leave behind. In the middle of his shift, the diner door swung open and Nathan walked in. His presence commanded attention, the tailored suit and quiet confidence making him stand out among the regulars. Zander set down the plates he had been carrying and wiped his hands on his apron before walking over. I wasn't expecting to see you so soon, Zander admitted. Nathan gestured toward an empty booth, and Zander hesitated before sliding in across from him. I wanted to check in, Nathan said. Make sure you're still on board with the decision. Zander exhaled, running a hand over the table's worn surface. I don't know what to expect. Nathan nodded. That's fair, but I'll make sure you have the guidance you need. You're not being thrown into this alone. Zander appreciated that, but there was something else on his mind. I don't have any experience in management. What if I'm not what you think I am? Nathan studied him for a moment before responding. I've been around long enough to know when someone has potential, you don't need to have all the skills right away. That's what training is for. What matters is your character and your willingness to learn. Zander let that sink in. It wasn't often that someone looked at him and saw more than just another worker trying to get by. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and placed an envelope on the table, sliding it toward Zander. Before we move forward, there's something else. Zander eyed the envelope, then looked back at Nathan. What is this? Nathan sat back. A way to acknowledge what you did for my mother. You helped her when you didn't have to. That kind of kindness deserves recognition. Zander hesitated, then slowly opened the envelope. His breath caught as he pulled out a check. The number written on it made his head spin. $5,000. His fingers tightened around the paper. Nathan, this is too much. Nathan shook his head. No, it's not. You didn't ask for anything when you helped her. That's exactly why you deserve it. Zander felt his throat tighten. He had spent years barely scraping by, counting every dollar, stretching every paycheck. And now, in his hands, was more money than he had ever seen at one time. I don't know what to say, Zander admitted. Nathan gave him a steady look. Then don't say anything, just use it to make things easier for yourself. Pay off some bills, get ahead for once. Zander swallowed hard. The weight of struggle had been pressing down on him for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Finally, he folded the check carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Thank you. Nathan gave a nod. You earned it. For the rest of his shift, Zander moved through the diner with a dazed sense of reality. He didn't tell anyone about the check, didn't even fully allow himself to process it. But deep in his chest, something had shifted. When Ellie walked in that evening, she found Zander by the counter, lost in thought. You look like a man with a lot on his mind, she observed as she took a seat. Zander let out a quiet laugh. That's one way to put it. She gave him a knowing look. Nathan came by, didn't he? Zander nodded. And he did something generous, didn't he? Zander exhaled. More than generous, he gave me a check, $5,000. Ellie's face softened, but she didn't look surprised. That sounds like my son. Zander shook his head. I don't know how to accept something like this. Ellie reached over and patted his hand gently. You accept it the same way you gave kindness to me, without expectation, without questioning whether you were worthy. You did something good, and sometimes good comes back to you. Zander sat with that thought for a moment. I never thought something like this would happen to me. Ellie smiled. Life has a way of surprising us. As the night went on, Zander felt something settle inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He had a chance at something more. And this time, he was ready to take it. Zander stood outside his small apartment, staring at the key in his hand. It was late, and the quiet hum of the city surrounded him, but his mind was anything but still. In his pocket, the check from Nathan felt heavier than it should have, a reminder that his life had just changed in ways he never imagined. After a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the worn-out furniture, the small kitchen, and the stack of unopened bills on the table. He had spent years scraping by, always one unexpected expense away from disaster. But now, for the first time, he had a way out. He sat down at the table and unfolded the check, running his fingers over the crisp paper. Paying off debts, catching up on rent, maybe even saving a little for the future, it was all possible now. But more than the money, it was the opportunity Nathan had given him that lingered in his thoughts. The next morning, Zander made his decision. He walked into the diner for his shift, but this time, he wasn't just going through the motions. He had a plan. After the morning rush, he found his manager in the back, counting receipts. The man barely looked up as Zander stepped forward. "I'm putting in my notice," Zander said. The manager finally glanced up, surprised. "Didn't expect that. You've been here a while." Zander nodded. "Yeah, but it's time for something new." The manager shrugged. "Your choice. Just give me a couple of weeks." Zander agreed, then stepped back onto the floor. It felt strange, knowing his time here was coming to an end. He had spent years in this place, watching the same faces, living the same routine. But now, there was something beyond this, a future he hadn't dared to hope for before. Later that evening, as he was wiping down the counter, Ellie walked in. She moved carefully, her cardigan pulled close, and as soon as she saw him, she tilted her head slightly, as if sensing the change in him. "You've made a decision," she said as she took a seat. Zander nodded. "I gave my notice today." Ellie's expression warmed. "Good, you're taking a step forward." Zander leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. "It's strange. I've wanted something more for so long, but I never thought I'd actually get it." Ellie folded her hands in her lap. Life has a way of showing us doors when we least expect them. The hardest part is deciding to walk through. Zander let those words settle. The fear of the unknown still lingered, but it no longer felt like something that could hold him back. As the weeks passed, he wrapped up his time at the diner, saying quiet goodbyes to the regulars and the coworkers who had been part of his daily life. When his last shift ended, he stepped outside, taking one final look at the place that had been his world for years. Then, with a deep breath, he walked away. Nathan had set everything up for him, and soon, Zander found himself in a completely different environment. The restaurant where his training would begin was nothing like the diner. It was polished, professional, and filled with people who moved with purpose. At first, it was overwhelming. The pace was different, the expectations higher, and the people around him seemed far more experienced. But Zander was determined. He listened, learned, and adapted. The long hours didn't bother him. He was used to hard work, but the challenges were new. Nathan checked in occasionally, offering guidance when needed. He wasn't just handing Zander an opportunity, he was making sure he had the tools to succeed. And Ellie? She visited from time to time, always offering quiet encouragement, her presence a reminder of how this had all begun. Months passed, and Zander grew into the role. He learned the business side of things, how to manage people, how to handle difficult situations. And slowly, he started seeing himself not as someone who had been given a lucky break, but as someone who had earned his place. Then, one evening, after a particularly busy shift, Nathan invited him to his office. Zander sat across from him, waiting as Nathan flipped through a folder. "You've done well," Nathan finally said. "Better than I expected." Zander absorbed the words carefully. "I've had good teachers." As Zander left the office that night, he thought about how far he had come. He had once been a man counting every dollar, stuck in a cycle he didn't think he could escape. But now, he had a future. And all of it had started with one act of kindness.